Well, good evening all, and welcome to this very special International Women's Day event at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, focusing on women in conflict and protest. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I also want to acknowledge that there are a number of senior diplomats and dignitaries in the room with us today, including the Afghan ambassador in exile. It's a real pleasure to have you and all of your colleagues here today. My name is Justin Bassey, the Executive Director from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I am going to keep my introduction brief because the focus of this evening truly is on women, the critical role they play in fighting against repression, in their resilience to the gender-related abuses suffered through conflict, and in advocating for social change and the protection of human rights, in particular for young women and girls. We know that peace processes are more likely to succeed and peace deals are more likely to last when we have women involved, yet we still see low numbers of female participation, and with conflicts and war ongoing across the world, both state-on-state and civil, it's more important than ever that women are heavily involved in peace and conflict resolution processes. And the crucial role of women goes well beyond conflict resolution and to the very heart of the cultural change we need through society. Women have been on the front line of many of the social movements that have formed across the globe in recent years, from the ongoing protests in Iran to protests in Myanmar and Hong Kong. The protests themselves are often front-page news, but the critical role that women are playing in these movements is often overlooked. So this evening's event is really about putting women front and centre, recognising they are front and centre, highlighting their experiences in conflict and protest, the gender-related aspects of conflict and repression, and highlighting opportunities for all of us to support women and ensure the protection of human rights across the globe. This is only becoming more important as technological advances may have benefited us in many ways, but have also enabled authoritarian regimes and criminal groups to abuse technology to expand their reach domestically and internationally to suppress and repress the most vulnerable. I would like to thank ASPI's Women in Defence and Security Network for prioritising these issues, not just tonight, but as an ongoing focus. And I thank our great panellists and all of you for your engagement. With that, I would like to introduce the Ambassador of Denmark to Australia, Her Excellency Pernille Kardel, who is going to provide some opening remarks and will introduce our keynote address for the evening. And following that keynote, Gai Brodtmann, ASPI Council member, will be joined by our excellent panel on stage for a moderated discussion and questions from the audience. Pernille, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today. And I have to apologize on behalf of my state secretary. You saw in the invitation that he was supposed to be here instead of me. He had to leave on short notice last night, so you will have to bear with me instead of with him. And again, thank you for inviting me to speak here in the opening for this very, very timely event on women in conflict and in protest. Before I start, let me also recognize the traditional custodians of the land that we meet on today and pay my respects to their elders. And similarly also recognize the many faces in the room tonight. Thank you for coming out tonight, both colleagues in the diplomatic corps and from other parts of Canberra. It's great to see a room full on an agenda like this. And as Justin said, on International Women's Day, it is really an opportunity to make a very special effort to listen to the voices of women who live in conflict areas, women who on a daily basis risk their lives fighting for peace, and women who rightly demand change and access to where the decisions are made, who legitimately ask for their voices to be heard. As we have seen over several years, women are often in the lead of protest movement. We have seen it in Iran, we saw it in Sudan, and I have to say there's a special place in my heart for the Afghan women who continue to fight against the Taliban regime's brutal treatment of women. I cannot but really be inspired and be dedicated because of their readiness to continue on really against all odds. They fight for their rights, they fight for peace, and they fight for justice. It's obvious that we need to find creative ways of supporting them. It's not easy, but it is important that we find a way of doing that. And we need to do that, as Justin was also saying. We need to do that because we know that when women are involved in work for peace, peace becomes more sustainable. It's also because it's the right of women. Women need to be involved. Women have the right to be involved in areas of importance in the countries that they live, with the issues that are important for them. When we look at the 3 different tracks for peace processes, we see a very different engagement of women. At the official level, the formal peace negotiations, the figures are pretty grim. Between 1992 and 2019, only 13% of the negotiators were women, and only 6% of the peace deals had a female signature on them. And in the latest report from the UN Secretary General, it's very humbling to see that those figures are going the wrong direction. And that is despite the fact that there's been a more than 20 years intense international effort to change these figures. They're going the wrong direction, and it's time to reflect on why. On the other hand, in the informal area of conflict resolution and peace negotiation, women have been more successful in getting access. And these processes are often what is actually paving the way for the actual peace processes. And I think we need to reflect on how we, it's a good example of how women will take action in their own lives and try to make a difference against all odds in situations that are really dire, and then through that make a difference. And we see that most significantly, and I saw that myself among the Afghan women in Afghanistan when I served there for the UN, we saw how women are very involved in conflict resolution at the grassroots level. And we see that all over the world. We see it in the conflicts in Africa, we see it in Asia. And it is really, there's a lot of bubbling going on there that is important. And it is that type of work that is very rarely actually recognized and visible. And again, I think we need to find ways of identifying it and recognizing it and giving it the attention that it deserves, both because of the brave work that's being done, but also because that is where the first building blocks towards peace are actually being made. It needs to be recognized and supported. And as we, Denmark, a candidate for a seat in the UN Security Council, you cannot but reflect on, so how do you actually work with, under conditions like they are today? How do you actually get to work with and best support that these voices of women are coming to the table where decisions are being made? And I would love if the panelists tonight can also reflect on that. What do we do better to actually make sure that your voices are being heard where decisions matter, for the sake of the rights of women and for the sake of peace? And with that, it is a really great honor for me tonight to introduce to you the keynote speaker, Shaharzad Akbar, who was one of my partners when I was in Afghanistan. She was one of the young Afghan women who was fighting at that point also against all odds, but for a better future for Afghanistan. She was an inspiration, as so many other Afghan women were. And she was, before the Taliban takeover, appointed as a commissioner for human rights and was working on that agenda for a while before she, as many other Afghan women and Afghans in general, had to flee the country. And she is now based in London, but is still trying to find ways of working, of course, on this agenda. So, and that is a very, very special honor for me to introduce Shaharzad Akbar to you tonight, please.
Greetings. I'm truly honored to be part of this event today. I'd like to speak about the human rights situation in Afghanistan, particularly the situation for women and girls, and the protests by women activists inside the country to defy Taliban's restrictions. As we all know, the human rights situation in Afghanistan since the military takeover of Taliban on 15 August 2021 has continued to deteriorate. there have been increasing restrictions on women's rights and freedoms. Taliban started by banning girls from secondary school. We unfortunately now have bans on women's ability to attend university as well as to work for the NGOs. The situation in Afghanistan has been described as amounting to a gender apartheid because all aspects of women's rights and lives have been impacted and restrictions have been applied. However, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the restrictions. Instead, I want to really focus on the response to the restrictions. Afghan women started mobilizing and trying to stop the restrictions and reverse the bans as early as 16th and 17th of August 2021. So as soon as Taliban took power, while the whole world was in shock by these developments, Afghan women marched on the streets, unafraid, asking for their rights and for the rights of the Afghan population as a whole. Since then, Afghan women have continued to protest in various forms. Initially, most of these protests happened on the streets and they happened also in other provinces outside Kabul. However, Taliban's response to protests was a very brutal crackdown. They arrested protesters, in some cases their family members. They then denied arresting the protesters. The protesters who are detained, who are in some cases tortured. The protesters and their family members were made to promise to sign a letter saying they will not protest again, and they will not speak about their experience in detention, and also reportedly that they will not leave the country after being released from detention. This brutal crackdown not only on protesters but even on anyone who dared to dissent or criticize Taliban on social media created a huge and widespread environment of fear, understandably. Despite this, the Afghan women did not stop mobilizing and protesting. They changed the form of their protests. Some of them still continued going to streets. Others decided to do protests at home and record videos and release them on social media. They produced pieces of music with their faces covered or read poetry. Some of them went out at night to do graffiti, and they have continued to do these forms of civic acts of defiance. To defy Taliban's restrictive policies against women. Afghan women also, some Afghan women activists also chose to utilize other ways to protest Taliban's brutality, to resist Taliban's brutality or their policies. So they started banning secret schools, secret classes, establishing libraries. So there were those collectives of women who also adapted a policy or a strategy of negotiation with the de facto authorities, trying to keep the light on. I think all these forms of activism, we can look at all of them as forms of protest, as forms of resistance that Afghan women have adapted in response to Taliban's brutality. And here I'm talking exclusively about Afghan women in Afghanistan because they are the closest to the reality, they are on the front line. But of course, Afghan women activists in exile also continue to advocate for the rights of women in mainland Afghanistan and for human rights more generally through various platforms, international platforms, through speaking in the UN Security Council, UN Human Rights Council, engaging with the diplomats. So there has been a lot of activism happening outside the country as well. In terms of what's going on inside the country, with the protests and with the mobilizing, one interesting factor is looking at the protesters themselves. Who are they? Do they come from backgrounds of activism? Some of them do, but most of them don't. They were school teachers or government employees, or in some cases writers and poets. And Taliban's return to power, in a way, pushed them, compelled them to adapt this activist role. And they are very reflective in the conversations that I have had with them, also in their public discussions about the fact that they need to learn from the mistakes of the past. They need to not be so reliant on the international community, that the change in Afghanistan will come from inside, that they have a very difficult task and journey ahead of them because of fragmentation, because Afghanistan is a very fragmented society, but also because the men are not standing up with them and for their rights. So these are some of the dilemmas and discussions that's happening within these collectives, and it's extremely inspiring because these women have been forced out of their jobs, they barely have an income, they're barely surviving, but they continue to mobilize. And they're not thinking of building organizations and having offices and writing proposals. They're really thinking more about collectives and sort of grassroots organizing and thinking about how to sustain that in a very oppressive environment. What's next for these women and their really courageous but lonely defiance of Taliban's rule? It's really hard to say. It's a difficult and heartbreaking situation. It makes me furious every day that the world has left these women on their own, that there's very little being done to support them politically or otherwise. But from conversations with them, you can see that they are unstoppable. They don't see any other way. Keep raising their voice, keep demanding attention, keep trying to change Afghanistan for the better, for themselves, for their children, and for everyone in the country. So I think on this 8th March, I just want to salute their courage, and I do hope that we, activists in exile, and the international community do better in standing in meaningful solidarity with them. Thank you.
Okay, I'm on, Jerry. Great, thanks. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here for tonight's very important conversation with these exceptional panelists. And just after hearing that message, there will be lots to discuss, and there's still a lot of fights that need to be fought. And like the earlier speaker, we salute their courage. The women in Afghanistan, the women in Iran, the women in Myanmar, all women who are courageously battling oppressive regimes and breaches of their human rights. My name is Brodtmann, and I'm on the Council of ASPI, and I'm tonight's moderator. So I'll ask our fabulous panellists to come up, but as they're coming up, I'll just introduce them. And as they're coming up, I wish you all happy International Women's Day. Yes, yeah, round of applause. It's really important to take today, the opportunity that is presented by today, to reflect on what's been achieved so far, but the fact that there's still a lot of work to be done both here and overseas. And today I had the great pleasure of joining carers here in the ACT who are invisible, who are involved in often thankless tasks, and they are actually being applauded and congratulated and thanked for their efforts. So there's still a lot of fights to be fought, and you'll be hearing about some of those fights tonight. So I'm very much looking forward to having the conversation tonight with this exceptional panel. We've got Mon Zin, who is in the centre here. Do you want to just wave to everyone? Who's the founding member of Global Myanmar Spring Revolution and a member of Women Activists Myanmar and Myanmar Diaspora's community in Sydney. Maryam Zahid is an award-winning Afghan Australian human rights champion, diversity and inclusion practitioner. She's a playwright and a social commentator. She's the founder and director of Afghan Women on the Move, a non-profit for women survivors of war and trauma that allows them to participate in life skill programs such as health programs, literacy programs, driving programs, employment programs and support programs. Sophie McNeill, many of you will know, is a senior researcher, Australia for Human Rights Watch, based in Western Australia. She was formerly an investigative reporter with ABC TV's Four Corners program, where she produced programs on the Hong Kong protest movement and the detention of Muslims by the Chinese government, and was also a foreign correspondent for the ABC and SBS in the Middle East. And virtually, have we got Nos virtually? Okay, Nos, can you hear us? Can you turn your mic on, please?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi, everyone.
Okay. Welcome. Nos Hosseini is an Australian Iranian, born in Iran. She fled alongside her mother and lived in refugee camps in Turkey and Greece and resettled in Australia in the late 80s with her family. Nos is a passionate human rights and refugee rights advocate and co-secretary and spokesperson of the Iranian Women's Association. Now we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion for about half an hour. And then we'll go to conversations with you, questions and answers from the floor. We've only got 15 minutes, so start working on your questions now, please. So first I want to start with Maryam. You came to Australia as a refugee at the age of 20. Tell us about the Afghanistan from which your family fled, and how do you see the situation for women now? We've heard a bit about it in 2023 compared with back then when your family left. And what are the typical challenges facing the women you deal with in terms of the work that you're doing with Afghan women on the move?
Okay, thank you. And hi, everyone. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. And also acknowledge the presence of our ambassador, Afghan ambassador here, and dignitaries that are here in the room. The question is, it's a good question, but it's a hard question because it takes me back where I was as a young Maryam. I had a pretty normal life before Taliban took over 26 years ago in Afghanistan when I was living there. My both parents were educated, and I had a pretty normal life. I had a room, I had a bedroom, I had toys, I was going to school, everything was okay. The green grass, this blue sky was pretty similar to what we have here. But then when Taliban came in the war, became so complicated, we were forced to leave Afghanistan, and I was 15 years old when I left Afghanistan and came to Pakistan and lived there for 5 years. And that time I have lost so much, and for those of you that I can speak from my experience that war takes so much from you, whether the war is small or big, it affects you and the trauma will last forever. I was lucky to come to Australia under Women at Risk program with my 3 younger siblings. But when I came here, and because of all the lack of and the challenges or the lack of help and support and the challenges that I faced as a woman in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan, I came with no prior education or work experience or anything that I could climb on or step in as a young or as a 20 years old Maryam. I had to force myself to go to a school, and I started from year 11 and 12, pretending that I was 16 years old at school. I did okay at school, and then to TAFE and to the university. And here I am. What I've done with Afghan Women on the Move as an organization or a grassroots movement, it was not based on aspiration, or I wasn't inspired by things that I've seen here for the past 23 years that I lived in Australia as a good citizen. But it was out of frustration. Frustration was coming from the lack of the systematic discrimination, the lack of support for multicultural women, the lack of support that I've seen that was focused on particular part of our community and minority groups like Afghan women. And in the context that I had with Afghan women in Afghanistan, it was not easy because there's a huge gap between community grass organization, women that works on the grassroots organization, and then to kind of get it to talk to your policymakers, to your politician. And I have met with every politician, at least in Sydney there, and I have photos for evidence as well. But it didn't do much except that they know us and they supported us, yes, in a sense that they were there. But because there's nothing much was for policies to prepare us if something happened or if another Maryam comes, we shouldn't be based on the perception of when a refugee comes, and they just will depend on the safety and the food here, and also to the settling. It's more than that. And I didn't have, in women like myself, the challenges that I feel that Afghan women have here, that they were those unconscious biases that were around that, they're safe. So there's not much happen for us to grow or having those stepping stones to be able to be ready for crisis like this. Look what happened last year in Afghanistan. It was, I had from every TV channels, every news channels were contacting me, every politician that I knew that they called me and we've spoken about it. And then everything just gone silent. Everything just gone silent. And the people that I know of, worked with, I had outreach office in Afghanistan, and I've done a lot of work there on lifestyle projects as well. And I can't contact with them because I don't have that reach out there and people that worked with us to come and take their responsibility and say, okay, Maryam, now that Taliban is there and we say that, sorry, we can't do anything because our forces are left and we have nothing to do with Afghanistan. But about with those women that we were inspiring and we just left them so hopeless. Today I posted so much messages and a few things that I wanted to introduce to the community, but I couldn't be that Maryam that I was 2 years ago. I was so, inspiring in terms of, got inspired to post about the importance of International Women's Day, despite that I like it for us to be speaking and having a platform, prestigious platform like this, and having women from grassroots organization or movement to come and speak to policymakers and to politicians. But it wasn't there today in me. It was like I had to force myself. I had to be there for the women that I'm in contact here so they don't their hopes don't die. But in Afghanistan, women are completely wiped out of everything that we take it for granted or we think that it should be for us. And imagine the millions of women that I, as an Australian Afghan woman, are responsible. Was thinking that 20 years of us and as Australian in Afghanistan made a huge difference.
Yeah, that's why the women that we've heard about what they're doing on the ground through collectivism, they are so courageous. And that message tonight was really powerful. Nos, can I go to you now? Now, the protests in Iran have a particular gender focus because they were sparked by the death of a woman arrested by the religious police, and you would have heard the reports today about the poisoning of the schoolgirls, and I think the numbers are up at about 5,000, which is just appalling. Can you just give us, Nos, some insights into the anger that women have towards the Iranian government? There's this strict dress code, but what other specific issues are Iranian women protesting against?
Sure, thank you so much for the question. I'd like to acknowledge all of the dignitaries and the panelists and ASPI for all the hard work that they put into today's event, and I'd like to wish you all a happy International Women's Day. I'd like to start by mentioning that today marks 174 days since the murder in custody of Kurdish Iranian woman Mahsa Amini. The murder of Mahsa by the morality police ignited an anger that's been burning deep inside women, young people, ethnic and religious minorities. And it's not about the headscarf at all. It's about dignity. It's about the right to walk down the street with your partner and kiss them without fear, as the lyrics in Shervin's song Baraye, which means because of or for, speaks to. It's about women's rights to have a say and to think as they please, speak out against unfair government policy without the fear of being reprimanded and being punished. Women's ability to stand for election or to nominate themselves for election and not be disqualified from having their name appear on the ballot paper because of their political views or because of their gender, and all because their views don't align with the views of the supreme leader who's yields ultimate power. So people are entirely fed up with this regime, and Mahsa's name and Mahsa's existence and her story has become the code word for this revolution. And the movement has so much support. It's so beautiful to see men and women standing together in solidarity and fighting for women's rights. Women and men are chanting Zan Zendegi Azadi or Jinjian Azadi, which is translated to woman life freedom. And there's a strong recognition that without women being free, no one is free in the society. So it's just remarkable to see people of all ages, genders, ethnic groups and religious groups standing together shoulder to shoulder and fighting against the gender apartheid regime that's engulfed and held the Iranian populace hostage for the last 44 years and continuing. And I pay tribute to all the women who have been slain whilst bravely defying and openly defying the barbaric practices and the human rights violations that are being perpetrated by this brutal regime. And I pay respect to them and honour their memory and the struggle that the fact that they've struggled to keep this momentum going and keep this movement going.
So, Nos, I mean, I know about the protest movement here in Australia, and that's the community here is very strong and very loud and very vocal and very public. But we've heard about the protests in Iran being quelled, people being jailed, people being killed. Is the movement still strong there? Has it gone underground? Is it still public, particularly given the amount of people that have been jailed, the amount of people that have been killed? Do you see it abating, or do you see it just getting stronger and stronger and stronger until a regime change?
I don't see the movement abating at all. I feel that people's cries for regime change are strong. People are resolute in seeing the end of this regime. There's no turning back. So what we've seen in previous uprisings is that the 2009 movement and previous movements have been about economic factors or the cost of living or about the fraudulent presidential elections. But this time round, they are all about freedom, women's freedoms, women's autonomy. And they're against the gender apartheid. They're against the genocide of ethnic and religious minorities. And they're against telling Arabs and Kurds and other ethnic groups that they can't name their child a culturally appropriate name, or women being told what they can or can't study, and their movement being controlled by the male head of the household. So this movement will not cease until the people see regime change once and for all. Then people aren't interested in reform at all. Women want ultimate change.
Yeah, and so do you feel as if it's different this time in terms of this protest, this anger?
Absolutely. It's completely different this time round. Women are incredibly brave. We have young students who are standing up and showing absolutely no fear at all. They're removing their headscarves. They're removing and destroying photos of the Supreme Leader and openly defying the regime's brutal forces. They're standing shoulder to shoulder and fighting back with their bare hands. They're removing their headscarves in plain sight, and they're chanting anti-regime slogans, and they're unafraid of the bullets that they're met with. They're unafraid even when they're shot in the eye and blinded. And despite sustaining injuries whilst protesting, they brush themselves off, get up and return to the side of the protest despite significant injuries and despite the significant cost to their own personal lives. It's just remarkable.
Yeah, it is remarkable, the courage and the strength. Thanks for that, Nos. Now, Sophie, I'll go to you. In all your reporting in the Middle East and throughout the world, and the advocacy around the world as well, what struck you as the powerful effects that women have had in protest or conflict for advocating for their rights? And can you give us any particular examples?
I think that there are too many to mention. It won't be fair to just pick a few, but in terms of ones that I'll never forget and really stand out, I still remember meeting with Ezra Abdul Fattah, an amazing leader of the April 6th movement in Egypt, who helped form these young groups that they set up Facebook pages under Mubarak trying to organise against the regime, and they actually went on to lead the revolution in 2011. So these incredibly brave young women who are using social media to connect in a way that they'd never done before. And unfortunately, Ezra ended up in jail, under the rule of military dictator Sisi, and tragic tale of what's happened to Egypt. I remember an amazing woman in the West Bank, Khalida Jarrah, a former member of the Palestinian Parliament, who has been arrested countless times by the Israeli army, held without charge, in detention, in jail, and really just not allowed to have her freedom of speech. And she is seen as a real threat. She's a secular woman who challenges not only the Israeli occupation, but the terribly corrupt men that have ruled the West Bank for so many years. And a woman like her has been silenced and failed to receive the international support that she should have received. And then another really amazing case that sticks in my mind is that of Rahaf Mohammed, the young Saudi asylum seeker. I ended up in a hotel room with her in Bangkok as she fled a situation of family violence in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, yeah.
And she was intercepted at Bangkok airport on her way here to actually seek asylum. And this was a young 18-year-old woman who used this incredible moment in the spotlight, created a huge Twitter storm and ended up getting a visa and going to Canada because it took too long for us to approve her visa. She was on her way to Sydney, but Rahaf managed to expose, the gender apartheid happening in Saudi Arabia, and use that platform that she suddenly had to really shine a light on the horror of what it's like to be a woman in Saudi Arabia, and what a sham it was to claim that women's rights in Saudi had been restored. So I think these are some of the cases that stick out very strongly. But one thing that they all have in common is that they ultimately felt pretty abandoned by the international community, by Western democracies, and that while they might have been encouraged to stand up, speak out, be courageous, ultimately they didn't receive the support or the resources or the international attention that they needed to succeed. And I think that that's what really sticks with me and makes me incredibly upset to this day that even while someone like Rahaf Mohammed managed to personally get her asylum approved and now lives a great life in Canada. She's an Instagram star, and really annoys all these conservative Saudi men who love to follow her and see what a great life she's having now. But the fate of women inside Saudi Arabia, while we see the Saudi government continue to try and greenwash itself, but also wash itself through these numerous tournaments it sponsors these days, and really try and claim under the new Crown Prince that rights have improved in Saudi, but ultimately, they still have male guardianship laws. They need to get permission to study, to do so many things in their life. So, yeah, there's still so much work to do, unfortunately, and so many things that I witnessed at the time. I thought this could lead to change, but actually it didn't, and that's pretty devastating to realise that.
So you're suggesting that the international community has a kind of short attention span on these issues.
It's pretty short.
In the fact that they encourage the early protest, they encourage that early sort of display of courage amongst women, but then they're not there over the long haul in terms of constant, tenacious advocacy and support.
Yeah, they're not. They often do abandon them. And I think particularly women in the Middle East who are facing not only, the struggle against repressive authoritarian governments, but, very conservative societies as well. So they're fighting these dual battles, but they don't receive the support they need. And often, unfortunately, the oppressive regimes they're fighting are led by these men that for many years have been, propped up by Western governments, or at the least they turned a blind eye to some of their worst excesses or human rights violations. So yeah, unfortunately, that real feeling of solidarity and being with them and sticking with them isn't felt by them on the ground at the end of the day.
Okay, well, that's a key message for tonight, isn't it? Yes. Stay stolid.
Absolutely, because the courage and the bravery is, it's hard to imagine at times how
exactly in
people,
jail.
Yeah, people who risk everything and then pay the ultimate price. Someone like Lajane Al-Hathloul, who dared to drive a car in Saudi Arabia in 2011 and spent several years in jail, was sexually abused, tortured in jail. She's finally out, but she's living under house arrest. She's under a travel ban. An incredible hero of Saudi Arabia, but yeah, that's the reality of the Crown Prince's Saudi these days.
Okay, thanks. And Mon, can we go to you now? Can you start by talking a little about the situation in Myanmar since the coup, and how have women been mobilising there in protest movements, both there in Myanmar but also internationally? And what are the specific roles that women are playing in the protests in Myanmar?
Thank you, Guy. I want to start by paying my acknowledgement to the Nanua people of the land that we are here today, and pay my respect to the elder, past, and emerging leader. So to talk about Burma, I think it's, I know that you asked me what happened since coup, but it's not right not to talk about what happened in the beginning. Burma was a colonization of the British colony. And, like as things go with the British colony, there is a divide and conquer strategies that they thrive on. And then that's how they have governed the country, colonized the country at the time. And there are a lot of ethnic minority in Burma and who has been systemically discriminated. So even though after the Burma has gained independence in 1948, Burma is still very much a long way to progress, because a lot of the Buddhist and Burmese-speaking majority hold office position, and then they enjoy the society status, whereas the ethnic minorities are systematically discriminated. So things continue, and we have a 2008 constitution. Nobel Prize winner Do Aung San Suu Kyi led government has been trying to bring Myanmar back into a very progressive democratic country. And with that, we have a lot of improvement. Women's rights, have been evolved, and then it has been progressing really well. In the parliament, there's an increase in the women who are holding the position, representing the parliament. So there's a lot of improvement, but with the coup, like just in a few days, everything just disappeared. Everything just, not just backslided, everything just gone. So, the whole country was very angry, and they wholeheartedly reject the coup. So they went out on the street, and then they started to protest. And a lot of them are, as you can see, like, organized by women activists. The three finger salutes and civil disobedient movement, we use a lot of acronym in the revolution. It's called CDM. It's also, triggered by, lead by women activist group. There are unions movement that are also led by women activist group. And then, obviously, military junta has started to fire live bullets into the crowd, the peaceful demonstrator. So, women can go on the street, so they have come up with all these creative things that are really inspiring for me, because Burma is a Buddhist country, and, our culture is pretty much, male dominant. So there is a belief that we wear a traditional longi, and if the traditional longi is on the clothing line up high, men are not supposed to go underneath because they're going to lose all their power. So the woman activist has come up with a strategy, and they put the string across the apartment, and then they put the longi on the line. And military security forces, want to crack down the protests and things like that, and then they can't run into the street.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and also they come up with things like flower strike, just like what Shaharzad said, and then what Sophie said. Social media is the life of the revolution. So social media is that's the advantage of this day and age. So women have come up with a flower strike. So they do all this arty thing in relation to the flower, but don't show their they don't show their face. And then, we use our three finger salutes. And we got the X strike that they come up with. So there's a act that we draw the three fingers on in a, different emoji. So they posted on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then it was trending. And they come up with silent strike. Silent strike is come up with women and like male student unions movement in Burma. It was so successful because when the war has started to become very silent on Myanmar on the first anniversary of the failed coup, Burma has shown the world with the silent strike. It was fantastic. It was trending in the media. So yeah, it was very, very inspiring. So right now what's happening is a lot of the women, so to talk about what's, the deteriorating situation in Myanmar is, I'm a number girl, so I like to talk with the numbers. We have like 53 million population in Burma. And at the moment, 30%, over 15 millions of the people are going to be dire needs of the humanitarian aids. And 1.2 million people are at the moment internally displaced, which just happened in a matter of, a year or two. And the country just regressed really badly. So at the moment, we estimated that the UN and Save the Children has estimated that 7.8 million children are going to be out of the school. So we're just talking about the school. So all these students who participated in the civil disobedience movement, it's really important to talk about the civil disobedience movement. It's also a very creative way that Myanmar has come up with. So essentially, the whole civilians in Burma are saying to the military junta that we're going to cut off your economic supply. We're going to impose the sanctions on you guys. So we're going to quit the job. We're going to quit all the government jobs. So all the, transport sector, telecommunication sector, anything like electricity sector, they quit. Health workers also have quit, like doctors and nurses, they also quit. And military has cracked down and they started to arrest them. So some has to be in exile now. And they are running a lot of the capacity building program because there's like a huge population of people who are in the CDM movement already in exile. And their mental well-being is so important because, they feel that the West has abandoned them. So in this capacity building program and movement, most women are leaders there. They're very good with, I don't want to say like it sounds braggy, but we're very good with multitasking. So, yeah, and so that's what's happening in Burma. It's very inspiring.
Yeah, just the range of mechanisms that are being used and all very, very local and meaningful at a local level. So in terms of those, I'm conscious of time and I do want to move to the more general question, but that social media campaign, the silent campaign, the Longi campaign, the flower campaign, is that been sustained or is it just?
We are trying to sustain it as much as we could, but the trending has declined. That's an honest truth, to be honest, because a lot of the revolution has been mainly supported by the Myanmar diaspora around the world. What's really promising for our Myanmar revolution is that we had an election, Myanmar people had an election in November 2020, and the civilian government has won the election. And through the constitution, they have formed a parliament called Committee Representing Tidang Suluto, CRPH. And then from that, they formed a government, which is called National Unity Government of Myanmar. We call it NUG. We have a National Unity Government of Myanmar Australia representative in the crowd today, over there. So Myanmar diaspora has been really supportive of the revolution inside Myanmar, and people in Myanmar rejected the military junta wholeheartedly, and they are saying that we have a legitimate elected government, and there's a lot of literature and studies that prove that junta is illegitimate. Any contracts that you enter with the state and then the country of the Myanmar, and then if you continue to making a business with junta, it can be disputable, right? And yeah, because of that, National Unity Government is the elected, and therefore we feel there's a hope. It's very unlike, it's not the same as Cambodia or Laos.
Yeah.
We had an election, that elections were fair and square, and then like they had a government. And that government has been diplomatically progressing really well. We have a National Unity Government of Myanmar representative office in Canberra here. And we have been gaining momentum, gaining recognition through the parliamentarian in Canberra as well as we have our offices. National Unity Government has office in Japan, Korea, US, all over the world.
Yeah, so all over the world.
All over the world. And also the foreign minister is a woman. So if junta were to rule, there won't be any space for women.
Yeah.
And because of the junta crackdown, and even though Myanmar has entered with UN Charter and then have a Geneva Convention for the elimination of all violence against women, they have entered the agreement. Even though they have that, the junta doesn't care, and it costs so much on women and children because they are the weaker sex, and then the junta would systematically target them and then crack them down and instill fear in them.
Yeah. Well, this leads nicely into the next question, which is to each of you. So quite often with these stories, particularly on Afghanistan, we all feel really powerless and sort of, what can we do to provide for support to women? So each of you, and Nos, I'll come to you at the end because you didn't get the heads up on this. So the first question, just one thing, one message, one ask. What would be your one message, one ask of individuals, each and every one of us here in this audience and all those who are listening virtually? What would you like us to do to support our sisters in Afghanistan, in Iran or Myanmar? What's the one ask of the Australian government? And what's the one ask of the international community? And Sophie, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think individually, I'm apart, from showing solidarity. I'm not just liking a post or sharing it, actually doing something. I think a really great thing to do at the moment is to talk to your local member of parliament and ask them to increase foreign aid in this next budget, because I think that what all research has shown is that if we actually invest in societies and build them up, invest in education, not just women but boys too, we reduce radicalization, extremism. That's really what changes societies for the better in the long term. And I think what we keep seeing time and time again, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, is that failure to invest long term, to actually really care about the fate of the people on the ground and not just about the strategic kind of issue that we're trying to address there, or the security problem that we're worried about. We have to actually invest in people on the ground. So go to your local member, ask to increase foreign aid. I think to the government, do that at this election. It was embarrassing in the mini budget. We really need an increase in foreign aid at the upcoming budget. And in terms of the international community, be consistent, speak out. If you're going to call out Russia for the horror that's happening in Ukraine, call out human rights abuses everywhere. Don't be selective. Be consistent in terms of upholding people's human rights and women's rights everywhere for all governments, not just the ones that you feel comfortable calling out, because, I think silence doesn't help anybody, and we need to hold governments to account.
Great. Mon.
Yeah, so for me, I like to ask that Myanmar hasn't been well known. Not a lot of people know about Myanmar. So if you go out there, if you went back to your family, go talk to your family and your friends and your, colleagues, anyone about Myanmar. And if you've seen any emails that are coming your way, like asking you to sign the petition or, ask for donation, or even any issues on Myanmar, don't just ignore it, don't just delete it. Please make a little effort to go and sign the petition, which is very important for our campaign, because we also ask the Australian government, what we have been asking is very easy. We want them to cut off the foreign revenue supply to the military junta. Australian government hasn't recognized, does not recognize, none of the government has recognized military junta as a legitimate government. And there is an evidence that the junta has been directly funding the gas revenue that they receive from the foreign company, like the Thai company PTT and Chevron, and Chevron is an American company, and POSCO is a Korean company, and then directly funding it to Russia, buying jets and weapons and arms and things like that. So that's what we want. And also in Australia, we might be unknowingly investing in the Myanmar mining company. So go out there, have a look, check your superannuation, see if any government's fundings are invested in it, and then write them a letter, get out, like tell them to divest from it. International community and organization, please help us, fund us, and make sure you tell your government, you tell the Australian government to give the fund directly to the civil society organizations who are walking on the ground, really doing the work, not to the junta-related one, because we don't want to fund the junta to commit their atrocities.
And this is international assistance in terms of funding, going back to Sophie's point?
Yes.
International assistance?
Yes. So for international assistance, we have to collaborate together.
Yeah.
Of course, we have to, solidarity is, we can find strength in it. So that's the only way that we can continue to raise awareness, continue to strive on, and make sure that, the media heard us.
Yep, great, thanks. Maryam?
For me, it's for one country that it's not been known, as you said, but for Afghanistan, that's been known to everyone, I believe. And it's become so politicized that it's becoming so hard to go even individually or as a collective voice to your local politicians, to the media, to everybody. Everyone is kind of blaming each other. And there is no that systematic pathway or a policy that we as an Australian been in Afghanistan for 20 more years, and all of a sudden everyone is out and the blame is all on Taliban and we have nothing to do with it. So how are you going to talk about it individually as a Maryam, as Afghan women, Australian Afghan women, or as an Afghan community here on the women that I have on the organization, 5,000 members, and also as a community that we are representing? There is not much being invested in community capacity building that to prepare us that when there is a war, there's a crisis happening in your country, how do you respond? Who do you go? Who's our representative here? My local MPs, they are very good, but they also depend on somebody else above them. And then we can, as a community and as an individual, you can go so far. But if there's a lot of things happen from top down, and there was nothing, and there's not much investment on the communities, that the community should be informed, should be. So
are you talking the community here or in Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan, yeah. Okay, in Afghanistan, there wasn't much invested in the communities there. Women now left with nothing. And now when I talk to them, and we've been doing a lot of work from the smaller things.
But it's challenging. I mean, how do you get the money to the community?
Yeah, and that's
given
that's
the
my
fact that
question
who's
too.
on the ground there now in terms of NGOs.
Yeah, but that's my question too. That what has happened? Where is that systematic work has been done in the past 20 years? That women don't. There's no bank. There is no bank accounts. There is nothing that women can individually be independent. So what we were talking about women empowerment in Afghanistan, and there was some noises were around, but it was very individuals. But the group of women, I remember when I was young in Afghanistan, a lot of talks were about Kabul women, and they would call it Dokhtara Kabuli, and I was always wondering what happened, who we are as a women, Kabuli women. And I thought that when I grow up, I'm sure Afghanistan, everybody will be, the women shouldn't be scared of getting killed, beaten, or humiliated just because they're women, and that should be across the country. But still, the Kabul only was invested in the past 20 years, and the rural areas is as isolated as when I was 5 or 7 years old, Maryam.
So just in terms of the message to individuals, because that's sort of kind of the message to government?
Keep talking. They don't listen, but keep talking. Keep talking.
Okay, great, okay. And now we'll go to you, Nos.
My suggestion is very similar to what the other panelists today have recommended. I'd say it's really important to continue to engage with the local community, attend protests, lend your voice to campaigns that Amnesty International and other organisations are running. So, for instance, 70-year-old Baha'i woman Marwa Shaharyari, who's a writer and a poet, has recently been sentenced she's been tortured and she's been in solitary confinement for 5 months. Narges Mohammadi, a prisoner of conscience and a human rights lawyer, has been in Evin prison for quite some time. Women like that really need us to lend our voices to the movement to have women like that freed. So it's really important to put that international pressure on this regime and other repressive regimes. And as Sophie mentioned, you need to call out human rights abuse everywhere. You can't say, well, this one's appropriate to call out, this regime's appropriate to call out, this government's appropriate to call out. Let's just ignore places like Iran because it just, it's in the too hard basket. But our government, Western governments, need to stop this diplomacy that's characterised our relationship between with repressive regimes. We need to stop pandering to them. We need to hold them accountable for all the human rights violations that they've perpetrated. And in the case of Iran, over the last 44 years, they've never been held accountable for the mass murder of political prisoners in the 80s, or for the execution of political prisoners and women, and the arbitrary arrest of unionists and journalists and so on. The list goes on. So for them they need to be held accountable for those crimes. And for that to happen, we do need to band together as a collective and put that external pressure on. And we can do that through organisations like Amnesty, through advocating for these causes by speaking to our members of parliament.
Okay. So that's the call to action for the individual speaking and advocating with your MP. Okay. Great. Thank you. We're now going to go, thank you, panellists. We'll come back to you because everyone's going to get a chance to ask a question. But we've now got a short video, which is a compilation of messages from Afghan women. And it's very powerful. We right to go?
Rights have been taken away from us, while
we're waiting,
controlled by men. Please, people all over the world, listen to me when I say this. We need your help. The women of Afghanistan need your help. Every day more women suffer under the Taliban regime. I repeat it again, we need your help. My last word to you are a quote by George Orwell. The most painful thing to experience as a human being is to desire your most basic rights. Help us. Don't let our basic human rights turn into dreams.
من حیثیت زن مبارز افغانستان از جامعه جهانی و سازمان ملل است که جنبش‌های خودجوش و زنان معترضی که در افغانستان حضور دارند اینها برخواسته از میان خود مردم هستند که درد مشترک با تمامی مردم افغانستان و خصوص تمامی زنای افغانستان دارند. زنان معترض افغانستان زنهایی هستند که از بی‌عدالتی با شعار نان کار آزادی فریاد عدالت خواهی بلند می‌کنند. زنان معترض افغانستان زنانی هستند که اینا نه کدام حامی خارجی دارند و نه پروژه‌ای هستند و نه با کدام سازمان بیرونی در ارتباط هستند. کاملا جنبش‌های خودجوش و دور از وابستگی با تمام سیاسیون گذشته و به دور از وابستگی با تمام سازمان‌هایی که در بیرون هستند اینا فعالیت می‌کنند. فعالیت‌های حقوق بشری در جریان 18 ماه در افغانستان داشتند. بنابراین خواست ما است که زنان را البته زنان مبارز را باید من حیث زنان بومی و جنبش‌های زنان معترض را باید من حیث جنبش‌های خودجوش زنان معترض در افغانستان بشناسند.
در کشورهای خارج از روز جهانی زن در حال تجربه می‌شوند که در افغانستان زنان زنده به گور شدند. زنان حق تحصیل ندارند، زنان حق کار ندارند، حق آزادیشان گرفته شده. حق ندارن که به مکتب بروند، به دانشگاه بروند، به وظیفه بروند. این در حالی است که ما زنان به عنوان یک زن نمیتونیم سفر کنیم، نمیتونیم به ورزشگاه برویم، نمیتوانیم به وظیفه برویم. زنان افغانستان که نصف از پیکر جامعه را تشکیل میده، بدبختانه که در افغانستان حذف شدن و هیچ توجهی به زنان افغانستان صورت نگرفته. دخترانی که باید درس بخوانند، آینده کشور هستند، همه خانه‌نشین شدند. زنانی که در 20 سال زحمت کشیدن، کار کردن، درس خواندن، تجربه کاری عالی دارن و اونا از بدنه کارشان، از بدنه قدرت، از بدنه سیاست حذف شدن، در حالی که زنان قدرت سیاسی دارن، قدرت اجتماعی دارن، میتونن در هر عرصه کار کنن. ولی بدبختانه که در افغانستان حقوق زنان پامال شده و هیچ زنی حق نداره که از حق خود دفاع کنه. ما زنان معترض که فعلا در افغانستان هستیم، از خانه های خود فراری هستیم به دلیل از اینکه ما حق خود از طالب خواستیم، به دلیل از اینکه ما به جهان فریاد زدیم که ما از بدنه نصفی از بدنه افغانستان حذف شده. چرا توجه نمیشود؟ چرا به زنای افغانستان توجه نمیکنین؟ زن افغانستان انسان است و او حق داره که کار کنه، حق داره که سفر کنه، حق داره ورزش کنه، حق داره که به اولاد خود، به دختر و پسر خود برسه و اونا را به آرزوهایشان برسانه. لطفاً صدای زنای افغانستان را بشنوین و نگذارین که زنان افغانستان زنده به گور شوند.
We women and human rights activists always raised our voice against the inequality, justice, not only the dark age of Taliban, but in past 20 years of democracy. The current dark era is not hidden from the world. Not only our demands have been fulfilled, but rather we persecuted, tortured, and threatened in the worst way possible. So we are an independent and covered movement among the people of Afghanistan.
Hi, my name's Ruth Elsley. It's probably not a question so much as a statement, although a little bit of a question. I was the last gender advisor in Afghanistan. So I have so much respect for everybody that has spoken today because I saw it firsthand and I left without being able to fix it.
Yeah.
So my question is, my job currently, I gave a talk today on International Women's Day, and I spoke about the women of Afghanistan and the women of Iran and the women of Myanmar, and basically, you know, made the point of the fact that the people that I'm responsible for have opportunities. I was surprised afterwards when I had spoken about the women of Afghanistan not even being able to take their children to the park. And most of the colleagues around me all came and said, had no idea that was happening. How do we educate the population? Because unless the population en masse across the world, you know, protests,
Yep.
then how are we going to make a difference? How do we get that education across? Because, I mean, you can see it's very passionate for me, but how do we do that?
Great question. Thanks for that.
Can I
Start, Maryam?
Yep. Okay. And I can feel I get so emotional as well. And I've been speaking about what can we do to educate the community there until the men and women and all across Afghanistan, the same message promoted, nothing will change. Keep talking about Kabul, going to Kabul, keep talking about security and Kabul and, you know, fixing big buildings. Apparently, those nice buildings were built in Afghanistan. Kabul. I haven't been there for the past 23 years. But what has been done to educate the men? What has been done to educate the men? What preventative, the early prevention programs about domestic violence, gender inequality, using the internet? You were talking about how the activism can be used through social media, but when you have so much poverty in your community, in your country, and you can't afford to go and buy food or buy milk for your children, no matter how much or how much you wanted to make the change in the country or the society, or if you can't afford it financially, nothing will happen. So my question, even from your question, is to the world that what has happened in the past 20 years in Afghanistan? There's only a few banks there and a couple of computers. And I am in contact with thousands of women, and they don't have all those things that they're no longer a privilege. These are the things that all should have it, and they should have it because in Afghanistan there was a lot of money gone. And what happened?
Mon? How do you go about educating?
Educating is something that, for me, from the Myanmar Spring Revolution, that's one of the positive outcomes that I have seen. And I participated in, because when I travel back to Burma, because Burma, majority of them are Buddhist country, and I went to the pagoda, I saw a monk, because he's wearing a robe, so he's a monk, and he was buying a bracelet for a little, for his young female friends, and then he was grabbing her hands and then putting the bracelets on her. And I wanted to say something, because this is so inappropriate for a monk to be behaving in such manner. But my auntie has stopped me from saying it. She said that you have to respect the rope. So that's the mentality that they have. I was like, no, that's not. That, like, because someone's wear a hood doesn't make them a monk. No. And so, at the time, like, I couldn't say it. Like, I decided, okay, like, follow her instruction, because, we are on a vacation. We don't want to get into any confrontation. So with this Myanmar Spring Revolution, that's one of the things that I have seen. The social media, like, Burma is so poor, but everybody went out there and then get themselves a phone. They love their phones, they love TikTok, they love everything. The social media has been advantages for us. On the social media, people are opinionated about it. There is a monk that is supporting junta. He came out and say, like, he gave an okay for the junta to shoot the innocent protester on the street to the head with a live bullet. He did that. And, people started talking about it. People started going on the social media talking about this monk. And that's a really good thing that I have seen. The whole country has wholeheartedly rejected the junta. And on one side, everyone is together. They are educated. We educated, like, the revolution moved to, like, we talk about the ICC, we talk about the ICJ, we went to the Security Council. So that's how it has been happening. And that actually can be sustainable. So that's why, education, people can't go to school in Myanmar at the moment. Like I said, 7.8 million estimated children are out of the school because the junta has been systematically doing airstrikes, systematically burning down the houses, destroying the villages, with their strategies. So because of that, we are doing this online education program, capacity building program. And Myanmar diaspora outside of the country, we are responsible. We take ourselves voluntarily, like we give that to ourselves. And then we're doing food fundraising every single week. You guys in Canberra, I can hook you up to if you're interested in Myanmar food. Every week we have the Myanmar food fairs that are happening. Go there, buy food, enjoy, taste, just be adventurous, and you'll be helping people inside Myanmar too. So that's how we have been sustaining.
Now, Nos, there's just on the social media, and I want to come to the mainstream media and the role that the mainstream traditional media that it plays. But Nos, the social media campaigns have played a huge role in mobilising within Iran, but also mobilising international support. So, what's your thoughts on this notion of education? How do we educate people and the role of social media in what's happening in Iran at the moment?
Social media has been such an incredibly powerful force that the young people especially have really capitalised on. Despite the widespread internet blackout and the prevention of information being disseminated outside, people are using VPNs to send out footage and imagery of the protests and sending through footage of protesters being brutalised. And we're relying on that reporting, and that education is so important. Otherwise, we won't know what's going on over there, because the regime's certainly not going to come out and give us accurate information around the statistics of the number of protesters that have been wounded or maimed, or the executions that are occurring in secret, and the sexual violence that's being perpetrated whilst protesters have been detained. So education is crucial, and social media is such a powerful resource that the young people are utilising very effectively, and they need to continue utilising that. So I'd say it's really important for us to do, if we're able to, just amplify the voices of the Iranian protesters by sharing these videos, and just ensure that ensuring that these messages reach the homes and the phones of non-Iranians, because they're the people that we need to echo the voices and to really support this movement for change. Because we feel as though in the protests that we're doing around Australia and around the world, we're preaching to the converted, we're preaching to Iranians, but we need non-Iranians to stand side by side, shoulder to shoulder with us, and be our spokespeople and be our supporters, so that the cause of the Iranian people and the cause of oppressed women all across the world are being taken up by non-Iranians or non-Afghans. I think that there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Sophie, just to you, I mean, you've played a key role in sort of amplifying the voices when you were with the ABC and in other capacities. What are your thoughts on sort of how to get the word out, education?
Look, I think there's been some brilliant coverage actually of Myanmar and the horror in Afghanistan lately. I think one issue is often we don't click on it, we don't read it. It's really hard to consume, and in our pockets these days, we have the horror of everything happening all around the world at our fingertips. And I think read it, let news organisations know that you care about good, serious international journalism, because we have seen cuts. There are less bureaus at the ABC these days. There's less international coverage, I think, on the 7 p.m. bulletin. So demand it and show that we do want to consume good quality international journalism. But I also think in terms of education, like one of the most important questions I think to ask tonight is, the lessons that departments and governments and embassies can learn from mistakes of the past. When we didn't prioritise a human rights focused foreign policy, where we focused too much on security and trade only, and we didn't give human rights a priority that it deserved, and how ultimately that is bad for our security, and that is also bad for our trade. And we really need to have a human rights focused foreign policy, and it's not only good for us in the long term, it's good for our region. It is good for security. And unfortunately, too long we've been having these conversations, I think, in silos. This is the security conversation, this is the human rights conversations. You can't separate the two, and we need to increasingly have these conversations in the same room, because look what happens when we don't prioritise human rights,
Yes, well said. And there's a lot of diplomats here and public servants from various relevant government agencies. So hear what Sophie has to say. But on that note, thank you to our exceptional panellists, and thank you for that question. And I could see that you're still doing it tough. Yep. It's been a terrific evening. This conversation isn't had enough, I don't think, and particularly across a range of areas. It tends to focus on one nation or another nation, but as a long-standing women, peace and security advocate, it's just great that we're actually having these conversations on International Women's Day across a broad range of issues. So thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for coming from interstate, to Sophie and Mon, Maryam and Nos. It's a pity you couldn't join us here tonight, but thank you for beaming in. And please, if you can join with me in thanking our panellists and join us.